Hey guys, and welcome to Fatherhood. You are listening to the Dad's Group podcast, a place where you and I get to connect with incredible leaders, shape the future of fatherhood together, and dig deeper into what is happening inside the minds and hearts of new and expecting fathers. In this episode, we'll be listening to Sam Gledhill, who is a nuclear medicine technologist, which I think is pretty cool, by training and has more than 20 years of experience in the healthcare and research sectors. He is currently working as Global Director in Digital Health at Movember, who are a massive and amazing support to Dad's Group. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we all meet on today. I would like to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people we have listening to this episode today. Cheers guys and enjoy.
Welcome, Sam.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, where are you calling in from, Sam?
So I'm dialing in from Melbourne. I'm in the southern suburbs of Melbourne. Enjoying a break in the rainy, miserable weather, but I'm looking forward to today's chat for sure.
Awesome. And we've also got Blair as well. Hi, Blair. Did you want to say anything? Blair will be chiming in with anything where Sam or I make a mistake.
I'd like to say hello.
Blair, where are you dialing in from?
I'm from Oburudonga still.
Awesome.
Yeah, it is a fresh morning. Yeah, you are not me.
No.
You can check that. Yeah.
Yeah, so Sam, we had a chat yesterday. It was really great to get to know you. Sorry for calling you on a public holiday down there. I hope you ended up being able to watch the game. And I hope that you're...
Yeah, watched a bit of the game. Although I've got to say it's a little bit disappointing as a Hawthorn supporter. My kids were cheering for Collingwood and it kind of hurt a little bit. So... Well, I'll have to have a stern talk to the boys about their priorities.
Yeah, that's actually raised a good question, Sam. Like, for your kids to have a win and you to have a loss, where is is that a win for you or a loss for you? How does that equate when you become a father?
Well, I've been advocating very strongly that they're Hawthorn supporters, and young Charlie, the 8-year-old, he's on board. He's 100% Hawks through and through, but they're having a bit of a struggle this year, the Hawks, and they're not winning as many games, and so it's hard to explain to an 8-year-old. That all of their success happened just before he was born, and we're in a bit of a rebuilding phase. But by the time he's a teenager, it'll all become good again. So I'm trying to navigate that pathway at the moment.
That does sound complex. It sounds like you're doing a pretty good job of it. Sam, we chatted about a few things yesterday that we might cover today. We talked about working dads, your role with Movember, your personal experience, failure and success, and also your background in that medical space and radiology, etc. I guess today I thought I might start with a question that is quite an open-ended question, but what fatherhood means to you personally?
What fatherhood means to me personally. So I think it's really interesting when we talk about like who we are as men, quite often when you meet someone for the first time, the very first question you ask or the very first question you get asked is, what do you do? And we tend to be defined, I think, a lot by the career that we're in or the job that we've chosen. And I don't often hear people say, I'm a dad. I've got these kids, or I've got, or I've got a family that's made up of my kids and my partner's kids. And we don't tend to generally identify ourselves as fathers first. Whereas I think women tend to be much better at it. So often when women meet, they're like, oh, tell us about yourself. It's like, oh, I'm a mum of 3 and I am a marketing executive or whatever. Like it always seems to be the opposite way right around for the women that I know anyway. And so I think that's really interesting. So fatherhood for me, or I think the challenge for fatherhood for me, is to think about how we can actually lift the profile of what it means to be a dad, because actually it's a fundamentally more important job than anything you get paid for, I reckon.
Yeah, that's good. And in your experience, you grew up with a father or without a father. Tell us about that experience for you.
Yeah, my dad is still around. We still see Dad fairly often. So I live in kind of suburban Melbourne, and I grew up down on the Mornington Peninsula, so a little bit out of town. And Mum and Dad still live out of town. So fairly standard nuclear family. So Mum, Dad, me. I've got a younger sister. She's 2 years younger than me. So pretty scripted, it's a pretty regulation orthodox family, and grew up in a standard, fairly standard white suburban living. Probably the one thing I'd say is, as I've gotten older and reflect on the opportunities and privilege that I had growing up, I think there's probably you don't realize until you have a chance to reflect on it that actually those existences are really privileged and we're really fortunate. And I think now I'm starting to experience the gratitude for that, particularly I think with my relationship with my dad. Dad and I are now really good mates, but we haven't always been. And I think that's a challenge that I think a lot of blokes face as well. Like there is this sort of, once you kind of hit your teenage years and you're growing independence, you want to kind of move away from those, those paternal structures that have kind of defined what you can and can't do. You push the boundaries, you push the edges, and you start to, revolt a little bit. But it's since I've had kids, I've found myself leaning on dad a lot more than I did when I was much, much younger, and in a really enjoyable way too. And I hope he feels the same. I might just be annoying the crap out of him with stupid questions, but he answers anyway.
Yeah, no, that sounds like it's a pretty good question to ask him. But I was going to ask you, what was some of the things that you saw made that change? As we all have struggles with our parents, mums or dads, sometimes over your lifetime, you have things that change in your circumstances that bring you closer together. And you referenced your children were part of that. Can you tell us a bit about what that might have looked like and how that felt for you?
So I think it was probably an acknowledgement that fatherhood's actually really tough. Like it's hard work and you've got to put a lot into it. And I think having my own kids and watching my kids grow up kind of made me reflect a little bit on and made me sort of see for the first time the effort that he put into us growing up as kids. And of course it was a different time back then. So I was born in the mid 70s. So that 70s and 80s period was very traditional. Dad's the breadwinner, mum's stay-at-home mum. Like that was kind of how we grew up, and that was the sort of environment we lived in. And so dad was working really hard and trying to put food on the table and put money in the bank. And but I didn't realize just what that meant until I sort of started to experience it myself and go, oh, actually. And we're now in a sort of dual income household, and as we think about all the things that we're trying to do for our kids, I think to myself sometimes, geez, it must have been rough doing this on one income 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
Yeah. So I guess the next question I had for you, thanks for that. I think that's really awesome to get an insight into, I guess, your fathering, but also looking back up at your experience of fatherhood and also understanding that, it's actually very difficult for us and it would have been equally difficult for our dads. But in that and over time, sometimes life gives you that opportunity to, I guess, reshape that relationship and have a bit more respect for what you may have once, or I may have once thought was an unfair element of parenting that you realize, oh my goodness, no, you actually did really well. That's it's important.
When I first joined Movember, I joined Movember in 2012, and the annual campaign that year was called Movember and Sons, and it was part of a 3-part creative series that we did. So we did 3 campaigns focused on. In the first year, it was the Modern Gentleman, and then there was a Country Gentleman series, and then the last one was Movember and Sons, and it was a kind of third of a trilogy of campaigns. And Movember and Sons was really focused about the transfer and knowledge, the transfer and power of knowledge up and down between generations. And Trav, our founder and creative guru, explained it in the season launch by saying, he said, remember like when you're growing up and you have a family barbecue and your dad won't let anyone near the barbecue because it's his domain. You're not allowed in. You have to and then he said, there comes a time in your life where your mum taps you on the shoulder and says, for God's sake, could you go out and stop your dad burning the steaks on the barbecue? And you go over and you take over the barbecue. Like there is this kind of transition of knowledge. And so you take all of the wisdom that you've learned from your dad or your father figures around the world and you channel it in, and then you start to share it back up the chain. So there's this kind of, the beautiful kind of reversal at some point in your life. And it feels like, I certainly feel like I've been through that transition with my dad, that now we've gone from this sort of, up and down relationship to a much more side to side, much more collegiate relationship, which I think is a significant turning point.
Yeah, that's great. And when would you say that happened? Like, is this a year ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago?
I want to say it's certainly, I can't pinpoint an exact moment. I feel like but it kind of transitioned, I think, over probably the last, probably at least maybe in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and your children are 13 and
I've got a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old. Yeah.
yeah, right. It's interesting to see that dynamic between the age of your children and those relationship changes with your parents. I know for me, it was a similar space of transitioning into how you connect with your parents and how I guess they turn from a someone who supports you to someone who sometimes supports your children.
Mm.
And in that phase, I think someone wrote the other day, it's funny how I used to have to ask my mum and dad if I could go out, and now as an adult with young kids, I still have to ask my mum and dad if I can go out.
Too true, too true. And my in-laws are 4 hours away, so and mine are about an hour away. So we've got, we have to plan in advance. I think that's probably the big fundamental difference we've got in our lives compared to maybe my upbringing, was that that support is actually a little way away, and we have to be much more coordinated and forward thinking.
Sam, you're with Movember. You do some pretty cool stuff with Movember. You got quite an interesting job title, which is Global Director of Digital Programs. Is that right?
Yeah, Global Director of Digital Health. So I've got a team. I'm very fortunate to work with a very talented team who have got responsibility across all of our digital health programs. So by there, I'm talking websites and apps that focus on direct-to-man interventions. So in the prostate cancer space, we've got a product called True North, which is a sort of, we're aiming to be the go-to resource for men who've been diagnosed and treated with prostate cancer to get tools and resources that they need to help them through that journey and improve their quality of life and improve how they work through some of the issues around treatment in prostate cancer. Similar thing in testicular cancer, we've got a product called Nuts and Bolts, which is a platform that men can go to work their way through the diagnosis and treatment for testicular cancer, get support from people who've been there before. So, the vision for Nuts and Bolts is that we see a world where no man goes through testicular cancer without a community to reach out to, and the knowledge and power that he can get back to living as healthy and healthy and long as life as possible. And then on the mental health side, we've got a couple of different portfolios. We've got the Fathers and Relationships portfolio, which is where I know you've done some work with Mark Dadds in the past. So Mark Dadds has done some great work, great parenting programs in the academic world. And one of the powers I think that Movember brings, or that the team that I'm fortunate enough to work with bring, is we can create really, really unique and beautiful user experiences that really engage with men and take the evidence base that's been built up in an academic setting and then kind of translate it and scale it to the masses and do it in a way that we know engages with men, do it in a way that we know will actually lure men in and give them a feeling like this is their space and let them feel a sense of belonging. So we've got the Fathers and Relationships, and the other part of the portfolio is again, thinking about that notion of scaling what works. We've got a program called Ahead of the Game, which is for young men in sport, and that's leveraged off some academic work called Your Path to Success, which is about mental health resilience and literacy. So that's a hybrid model where some of it's delivered through in-person facilitated workshops, and then other parts of it are delivered in an online app-based setting, and that's been a really interesting journey. We've partnered with Rugby League Cares in the UK to deliver that to rugby clubs throughout the north of England, and it's been a really successful program.
Awesome. So it's quite a broad scope of work that you're doing with Movember, and that the point around, as obviously we work with new fathers in the expecting fathers space in that perinatal period. Family Man is a program that you talked about. Now, how would we engage? So how would we share with a new father how to engage with this and why? I guess the most important thing is, you're expecting a new father. You've got a little baby, 2 weeks old. You've got sleepless nights. You've hopefully got on some parenting, work leave, some parental leave.
Yeah.
And you're struggling. It's nighttime and you haven't had much sleep. And why Family Man?
Yeah. So Family Man's targeted probably for slightly older kids. So probably so the target age for the children for Family Man is 2 to 8. So it would be something you'd probably want to get into to prepare you for perhaps the journey you're about to embark on. But I think the core of your question is like, why Family Man? We believe that Family Man is the first parenting program targeted specifically for dads. It's not exclusively for dads. There's a great deal of research that shows that mums can get as much out of this as dads do. But what we do know is that the bulk of the education and service and support that's provided in that peri and postnatal period is focused on mums, and we see a lot of effort focused on mother-child bonding. There's maternal health, nursing care. There's all sorts of after delivery care that you get as a mum. We don't see a high level of engagement from dads, and part of that is sort of structural and historical. That's not been something that there's been an enormous amount of demand for, but I think that is shifting, and I think that it's groups like Dad's Group that I think are really sort of pushing the envelope and saying, "Hey, listen, we're 50% of the audience here. We need some support as well, right?" And so I think I would say, why Family Man? It's something that, again, Movember's got this unique sweet spot of being able to speak to men in a language that they understand and speak to them in a way that resonates. So you're going to get straight up and down advice from Family Man that's delivered in a way that you get, that just kind of makes sense and that you understand. So I think it's probably, whilst it's not exclusively for dads, it's probably one of the opportunities we've got as Movember to talk to dads and give them some tools and resources and some tips and tricks to help them along the journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's great to hear. I mean, the point that you're making there is an interesting one around, it's not exclusively for dads, but it is actually the one that is designed with dads in mind. It is, so as a father or a father figure, you know that it's been designed for you, which is different to, let's say, the Department of Health and their health programs and their, all the different programs that come out of the Department of Health and Department of Social Services. They've got family programs. Unfortunately, our culture, as you would probably agree, you've kind of referenced before, shapes parenting around mum's role, and that's a cultural thing, not necessarily how people want to do it these days. And I think what's exciting about Family Man and those types of programs is they haven't designed it as a family support program where dad can come if he wants to. They've designed it as a father-focused program where anyone can benefit from it, but it's making the statement that fathers are very important in that space. And if we support fathers, and I think this is probably aligned with our beliefs and principles, if we support fathers better, we're going to have better relationship support for mums and dads, and we're also going to help better improve the childhood development outcomes of that child. So it's looking at the father from a holistic perspective, and being able to support that whole, new family space, because we know it's particularly high risk for mums and infants and for dads in those, whether it be isolation, anxiety, suicide, family violence, or poor childhood outcomes. And
I think you're 100% spot on, and I think that whilst the work that Movember does is focused on supporting men, the collateral benefit of better support for men actually includes better support for whole communities and society as a whole. So it's not like we are saying we should only be focused on men's health at the cost of anything else. Actually, the evidence is quite strong that if you support any particular group, there is collateral benefit to other groups, and there is other benefit that can be had that broadens the scope and the impact of the particular focus that you've got.
It's so great to see that. And do you foresee more things coming out in this fatherhood space with Movember?
Yeah, I think so. I think certainly the way we approach, from getting a little bit technical, but the way we approach our product is we look at product market fit, and we identify a market, we identify an unmet need, and we've now got Family Man in market, and it's now doing really, really well. As we think about then, okay, where can we grow and what scope and scale can we put around this particular product? Can we go into different market segments? Can we go into different elements? Can we solve different problems? Those questions are constantly being asked by our product teams. And so I think there's absolutely a space where we can say something along the lines of, hey, well, if this is targeting parent dads of kids aged 2 to 8, is there an opportunity for us to leak that market forward and say, what about pre-walking and toddler? age kids? Can we start to think about, is there modules or is there pieces of the puzzle that we can start to solve for that group? And equally at the other end of the spectrum, say actually once kids start to get into that preteen hormonal maelstrom that certainly I know I'm living through at the moment, can we find tools and resources that might help those people as well? So I think absolutely the products are intended to grow, and I think they will over time for sure.
Fantastic. Well, that's awesome. As you know, or you may be aware, our approach with Dad's Group is to connect the best available resources to dads as fast as we can. So it's actually about Family Man's great, but how do we get it to the dads? How does every dad of a 2-year-old know about Family Man? And one thing you can do is do a big promotional campaign, but how do we spread that message faster and more effectively? And we want to be able to help Movember and Panda and SMS for Dads and those types of organizations who are delivering digital or remote delivery support programs or remote hotlines for dads, so that they can actually, fathers can know there's not just this, but there's a suite of products now that weren't around 10 years ago.
Yeah.
They're actually tried and tested, they're evidence-based, the outcomes have been demonstrated, and they're helpful. And that's our hope. So I think as you grow as Movember grows, and we also work with you in a number of different pockets and projects that we're doing, including this one, it's an opportunity to collaborate towards a better, healthier family outcome with fathers in mind, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
You talked about that maelstrom teenage challenging years. I'm going to jump across to a question around. So firstly, I'll tell you the reason why we ask a question like this is because it helps all of us feel normalized. So you're here as the expert in the expert interview, but also you are like Blair or like myself. You are an awesome dad with his failings. Can you share us one of your failings in that teenage or maybe early years? Tell us something where you feel like you didn't nail it, but there's there's something that you've learned from that you could share with.
Yeah, you gave me a heads up that you'd ask me this question, and I've been thinking about it. And in actual fact, there's a lot to choose from in terms of where I've stepped and erred in my own parenting journey. But I think a really recent example, and I think there's probably two. One's a really good one, and one's a not so. One's a good success story, and one's a not such a good success story. So on the failing side, my oldest is 13. He's just started high school, and he's going into year 7 this year. And he's going to a school where he's going to a separate school to where his mates from primary school went. So he didn't know anyone at the new school. And so we were a little bit concerned that, we wanted to make sure he settled in, that he made some mates, and that he, got himself a good group of friends around him. We're now at the end of, or halfway through the year, end of semester 1. And the good news is he's made a whole host of really, really good mates. Like the unit that he's put together is a really, really tight group of really, really good friends. The problem is that doesn't translate much into a lot of schoolwork. And so we've been on him a lot for the last 6 months or 4 months, saying, come on, surely you've got home. And there's this just like vagueness around. He's just not used to being in an environment where he has to think about what homework he's got to do. He has to think about what work has to be done. He has to plan and be prepared. And so we're on him all the time. Emma, my wife, and I are constantly on him all the time. And I think, so the point I'm getting to, the failing bit, is I know in my heart of hearts, and my intellectual brain tells me, you've got to find something positive. All he hears from the world at the moment are negative things. All he hears about is, you've got to do this, you have to do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to get onto this, do that. And everyone's telling him what to do, and everyone's giving him instructions, and everyone's telling him off when he doesn't do it. And I don't want to be part of that voice. But I can't tell you how many times I've walked into his room and he's not been doing his homework, or I've walked into something else and I get another note from the school saying he hasn't done this piece of work. And I walk and I'm like, come on, what are you doing? And there's a tiny little voice in the back of my head going, Sam, you're an idiot. What are you? Like, you're just making this problem worse.
Yeah.
Like, you're not helping. Stop. But I just can't stop. And then the guilt that comes straight after that, like within 15 seconds, I walk out of the room and I go, oh, that was not good. That wasn't what I was meant to do. I'm not being a good dad right now. So I think So I agree. Fatherhood is tough, and it gets tougher.
Yeah.
But at least I think the bit that saves me, the bit that saves my sanity, is that I know the more parents I talk to, they're all having the exact same conversations with their 13-year-old kids, particularly boys. So I know that it's not something that's unique to us. And I know that I'm not unique in that I'm not the only dad shouting at his kids about not doing their homework. But that doesn't mean that I don't feel guilty. As soon as it's done, I'm like, that is not no one's writing a book about how to go in and shout at your kids. That's not how it works.
Hey, Sam, that was such a wonderful example, and it was so truthful, and I resonated with it. And I know that anyone who hears that will resonate with that, whether your child is 7, 27, or 7, maybe a toddler, 17 months old. Um, it's hard, and you've just demonstrated that so well. And you haven't come to it with like, this is bad, but here's the solution. It's just not great,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
you've outlined such an important part. It's just not great, and I'm suffering through it, and I suck at it, and I feel guilty. The best thing about this place is actually just the fact that everyone else is. I'm in good company, and I think
yeah,
that message is so powerful because we don't always, as I'm not sure if it's a male thing or not, but we like to give solutions. We like
yeah,
to say, here's the failing, and here's the solution, and here's the bad, and here's the good. We don't like to sit in that space of going, this is not great. And I think you've just demonstrated that and role played that so well. And that's what we seek to do is be okay with it not being okay and be in company of people who can actually, I guess, support each other in that space. And that's exactly what you've said. You've got those other parents, they just by being them and just by being there are supporting you and your
yeah,
literally your mental health.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and I think what you've outlined is something that resonates with everyone in that parenting space. It's challenging, and there isn't always a solution, but it's about riding through the storm and knowing that others have gone through before you. As you mentioned, your father before,
Yep.
like he's gone through that storm, and the outcome of that. There's positives and negatives and challenges and good things that in your character you would identify with. Um, but but over the time, the things that were challenging for you, you've even demonstrated they've come back and turned a full circle to a respectful relationship with your dad and around that. And you could only hope and expect that that might happen, with your children. So it's pretty
Yeah,
awesome. Thank you for that.
yeah, absolutely. And then on the positive side, it was his birthday not that long ago, and he had a party on the weekend. We went to Bounce, the trampoline place, and he had sort of 13 or 14 of his mates come along. And as I was watching him interact with his mates, it was just amazing to see this group that have formed such really, really tight bonds in a relatively short period of time over their first semester at school. But anyway, we were after the party, we came home and we were reading through the birthday cards that they sent him, and I was really touched because these young boys had written the most beautiful things inside these cards. They'd written, "Hey Henry, thanks for being such a good mate. It's I'm so pleased you're in my class at school, and I had a lot of fun." And someone else had written, "Geez, I hope we get to spend more time together through our high school, and I'm really enjoying having you in my class." And I kind of it was staggering to me. I can't imagine as a 13-year-old me that I'd have written something like that in a birthday card to a mate, particularly early on in our friendship. So I really kind of I'm hopeful that as we look into future generations, that actually this notion around vulnerability and expressing yourself and being open to emotion is something that I hope future generations. It feels like we're headed in the right direction anyway.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, like in my opinion, pockets of our culture are doing that well. Pockets are not, and I think
Yeah,
our job in your job, my job, Blair's job in this space is to do your little bit. And what your little bit, you work for the biggest men's health charity in the world, and your little bit will make a big difference in the way that you do it. But someone else might be just in a job that isn't as influential from the fatherhood space, but they are part of a community, they are part of a family, and their little bit is equally as important. And I think today you've touched on some really key things around vulnerability and identifying failure and sitting with failure, and but also looking at the bigger picture around making a concerted effort to I guess design a better future for your own personal family, but also in your professional life, you know, for other families, and maybe that'll change the narrative to some of these thousands of isolated new fathers or you know, older fathers in the future.
Yeah, and I'm very privileged. I do get the chance to work in a large organisation that does this, you know, every day of the week. But that doesn't diminish. I think you made this point. That doesn't diminish the fact that someone in a sporting club somewhere in the mid coast of New South Wales or up in Albury Wodonga with you, Blair, someone's sitting at that footy club turning to his mate saying, "Geez, I'm really struggling with the kids this week," and his mate says to him, "Well, hey mate, so am I." That can be just as impactful for those two as anything that we have the privilege to be able to do through our respective organisations. So whilst we've got a microphone to be able to shout into and say these things, the actions and behaviours, I think, of people in the community and of, you know, dads getting around other dads around the world, there's an enormous power in that.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Yes, last night we were talking with some of the on Men's Talk for National Men's Health Week, and there was a guy over there who's done exactly that. He's a local fatherhood champion. He's done his little bit, started a dad's group, and now there's 400 members of his dad's group. You know, new fathers, young babies, all this kind of stuff, and he's just doing it his way. Which his way is they're doing, you know, paddleboarding trips and fitness things in their group, and you know, it's just beautiful to see that, you know, someone's little bit is only they can do that. And it's the same way that we talk about fatherhood. You're the only guy who's going to be the dad to your children. And
yeah,
by virtue of that, you are the best dad in the world, because you are the best dad in the world. And that's an appropriate term to be for you, but only you can do your bit. And it's about stopping, reflecting, and thinking about what is my bit, or what do I want my bit to be, what's going to count with all the limitations that we have. And it's really awesome to hear your story in that space. A tip or a piece of encouragement to a new father, given that our audience is largely new and expecting fathers, if you might want to reflect on your time as
I've got a great tip, but it wasn't given to me, so I have to attribute this appropriately. One of the great dads that I work with, a guy called Jeremy, we were talking about fatherhood at work one day, and he said he was a very nervous new dad, and he's just petrified he's going to stuff it up, and he's now got 3 beautiful girls, and he was on the very first perinatal visit that they went to the hospital, he went along with his wife, and he said to the nurse, "Look, I'm really scared that I'm going to stuff this up. Like, I really want to get this right. Like, I'm petrified that I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm going to get it wrong." And she looked him in the eye and she said, "Mate, you're here and you're trying your best. You've already won the lottery. You're already doing the best you can, and that is all that your kids can hope for. So just keep turning up and just keep doing your best." And I think that's all we can do, right? Is just keep turning up, keep being there, and just doing the best we can. That is all our kids expect of us. I think you and I had a really great conversation yesterday, Tom, about how forgiving kids are. They know that we're going to get this wrong from time to time, and no one forgives you more than your own kids. But they can only do that if you're there to start with, right? So just be there and try your best.
Yeah, that's so true. And you know, I've been the beneficiary of forgiveness I don't deserve, and I think every father in the world either has or will be the beneficiary of forgiveness they don't deserve. And I can't explain why our children do that, but the evidence and the research there demonstrates that they continue to give you the benefit of the doubt way more than they would to anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no skepticism in your own kids, is there?
No. And so we have, you know, the opportunity and I guess the responsibility to use that trust and that over, you know, that love that they've given us for whatever we choose to do with that. And we can choose to, you know, be absent and move away from that because it's too hard, or we can just sit in that hard space with them as the storm goes through, and then realize that was all we needed to do, was just, as you said, be there.
Yeah. And I think the world has kind of shifted around us now. This pandemic has taught us that due to, and you know, as a Victorian, we know what being locked down feels like. And there was a lot of time where actually all we could do was turn up and be there because we had no choice during those lockdowns. But as we emerge from this pandemic and the world shifts towards hybrid working models where, you know, I now work 2 to 3 days from home and 2 to 3 days in an office. And I think that's probably for the majority of working dads, that's probably going to be the scenario, unless you're on the tools or, you know, you've got a job or you're a health worker where you've got to go to a place to do your work. But for a lot of office-based workers, there is this hybrid world emerging. And that gives you great latitude. So I can now do school drop-offs and school pickups, and go if I need to. I can arrange my day so that I can go to an assembly if my kid's getting an award, or I can, you know, be around. So I can do. I worked this year. I worked at the Mother's Day stall, so that the poor old mums who organised it didn't have to know what they were getting as a gift on Mother's Day when they when they got the crappy little presents that they open up on a Sunday morning. But
we'll edit out crappy.
Well, at the price point of $2, you don't get much choice. But I think that freedom to be able to do that has really been amazing for me. Like, it's really been great, particularly with my young son Charlie, who's still in primary school. It's been fantastic to be able to just be around and see him and go and pick him up after school. And what I'm seeing at the school is there's plenty more dads doing pickups and drop-offs now than there would have been maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah. So the culture is changing, and we're all having a small but important influence on that, which is, I think it's really exciting to see. You know, it's amazing to hear about your work in that kind of global space, Sam, but then also to bring it back to just the school and the Mother's Day fair and, you know, your kids and struggling through it. Like that's what we've all got a similar story of, you know, the big picture, but then the small picture, and the dishes need to be done, the laundry needs to be done, the lawns need to be cut. The kids need to be spent one-on-one time with. You know, I know that's something for me that over the years has been like spending time with all my 3 kids is always done, but spending time one-on-one is less done. And I think that's another thing that we can possibly talk about at another time. I do have another question. It's around the digital space. It's probably, hopefully it doesn't unpack a Pandora's box or a can of worms, but digital health into the future is, as you would expect, as you would perceive, is quite exciting. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in the role that you're in. So tell me a bit about what you think the digital space might become in the future, specifically for, you know, men's and fathers' health.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to kind of crystal ball where tech might go. But one thing we know is that the rate of change, the rate of growth, and the rate of innovation in tech isn't slowing down. Like we're not getting slower at developing new things and new technologies. And you look at how, even in the space of, think about when we grew up, no one had a phone at high school when I was going through high school. And then everyone, it was at the kind of very tail end of high school, people started getting a phone so they could ring people. Like, and now ringing people on your phone is the last thing you do with it. Like, it does everything else first, and then eventually go, oh yeah, and you can make calls on it as well. Like, it's the growth and explosion of technology is extraordinary, and I think it's only accelerating. So who knows what's coming in terms of new tech that might be on the horizon, and this interconnected world where, you know, everyone now has high-speed internet connections in their homes, and I think recent data says that even in, like, across the US, smartphone usage penetrates around about something incredible, like 95% of the population have access to a smartphone. More people have access to a smartphone than they do to 3 meals a day. So it's incredible how intensely reliant we've become on technology. So what does the future look like? I think the future looks like whole host, like data's the new oil, right? Like, everyone's selling data, everyone's trading data, and people are starting to wake up and going, oh, actually, maybe I need to be a little bit more protective of my data. Maybe I need to think about what I'm telling people about who I am and what I do. And so I think there's all sorts of frontiers that are going to be navigated across the next sort of 5 to 10 years. But certainly things like wearables, the Internet of Things, the connectivity between devices is something that's going to become, I think, fairly ubiquitous across just about everything we do, because it's an enabler of things. It enables people to not have to worry so much about labor as much as they have to worry about the other more kind of philosophical types of their world. The things like being a good dad, you know, you can concentrate on the innately human things and let the machines do the machiney type things.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to see that perspective. And as you design, with Movember, more and more interventions in that digital space that genuinely help thousands, possibly tens or hundreds of thousands of people, you can see that there's great benefit to that. The flip side of that, as you know, my perspective is that there's help, and then there's help, and one of them, they're both important. Some of them might be digital, some of them might be face to face, but where do you sit in that space? I don't want to be too controversial, but in your role of switching off.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I certainly see, again, going just reflecting on my own experience. My son went into year 7, and he's going to be catching a train or a bus to and from school from time to time, and so we bought him a phone. And gave him a phone as part of his, you're out of primary school, you're into high school. We need to be able to contact you in case something goes wrong, or you need to be able to contact us. So here's a phone. And it seems to be a fairly standard rite of passage. Certainly we weren't the exception to any of our friends who've got kids going into high school. It was about the age that kids start to use technology. Right. But it's really opened our eyes a lot to just how addictive these things are. We're now having serious conversations about how much control do we want to put around the usage of that phone, because it's not something that innately we can trust him to self-monitor and self-regulate. So we're going to have to put some controls around that, because it's amazing just how quickly and how readily he was able to adapt to becoming essentially addicted to this device in his hand. And so you're right. The challenge is, how do we on the one hand both enable these great enabling technologies that can really push frontiers and push the health and push digital health forward, but at the same time, sometimes those things are not going to be tech. And so, the old Spider-Man saying is probably a great one. With great power comes great responsibility, right? So I think that there is, interestingly, I saw a headline of an article that TikTok are now actively creating elements of their product or features within their product to stop people from continuously scrolling through their platform. Like they're now sort of taking the responsibility to say, we know that people are spending far too much time just mindlessly scrolling through cat videos on TikTok. We need to put a stop to that. And so they're actively discouraging people to use their product. And there's I think there'll be an interesting sort of revolution in the tech space to say, where do we put the boundaries? Yeah. Because it's one thing to get people into the door and get them using your product, but then you've got a responsibility to make sure you're not doing any harm with that product.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's unintended harm in so many of the different elements of what we do. And that's why it's so important to work with the experts in universities to give some evidence or work on the evidence for your program to make sure that you're limiting the negative outcomes for that. And I think, in our world, we're wanting to build human relationships, father to father, with their babies, because we know in that space, essentially the magic happens. There's what you talked about before. There's that sense of normalizing the challenges. There's also that sense of I'm being supported just by having some time or a coffee. I'm actually being supportive to my partner or my wife who's having a sleep in or some time off or spending some time catching up with friends, and I'm also bonding with my infant. So that to us, that is the goal. If we can get as many fathers to that experience in the perinatal period, then that's what we're aiming to achieve. But there's a really important space, and Blair will attest to this, is actually getting them there in the same way that it takes 5 or 10 nudges for someone to purchase a product. Like Family Man would be no different, and our digital programs need to nudge and connect and reconnect and remind and remind again, and then invite to our actual events. So it's important to know where digital can support that overall outcome. But unless you have that overall outcome that isn't simply scrolling on TikTok, then as health program designers and creating and innovating new models of care for fathers, it's so critical that we work together with different organizations and share each other's learning, so that we don't fall into another pit of measuring success based on number of downloads or activity, because Yeah, it's
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. I think it's one of the things that I find really rewarding about particularly our, and it's not a dad's program, but our Ahead of the Game program for young men in sport is actually it hits a couple of key points. It is in a space where young men are already at, so they're in sporting clubs already. So you're leveraging a ready built community. But you're doing it in a face-to-face delivery mechanism. So these kids are getting into rooms together and working through these things together. And then there's a digital element where they go off and then can continue the journey as a supplement rather than being the focus of the intervention. So I think that's a really nice, I really like that hybridized model where you actually get a bit of face-to-face time, you get a bit of that peer support, peer group building, delivery of the mental health literacy piece, and then you can go off and do work in your own pace through some of the other modules of the digital experience. But this is where user experience is going. Like I think that whilst my role is in a digital health space, much of what we talk about from our user experience is actually what does the end-to-end experience look like across both in and out of that digital arena, because that's the really important piece.
Fantastic. Finally, you used to be in radiography and in the medical space.
Yeah, I'm a nuclear medicine tech by trade. Not many people know what nuclear medicine is. It's a bit of a boutique field. So I often say radiography because it's the same undergraduate degree that you go through in radiography. So X-ray technicians who take the X-rays. Nuclear medicine is a field where you administer isotopes or radioactive agents into humans, into bodies, as either through injections or through meals or inhalation, and then you track where it goes throughout the body and how the biology of the body is consuming up these radioactive traces. So I spent about 15, 20 years working in the hospital sector. Did a little bit of research, did a degree in statistics because why not? Everyone loves statistics, right? So then we went off and did a little bit of research in the anesthetics department, and then eventually a role came up at Movember that needed a bit of a research, imaging, and project management background. I kind of said, I can do some of that. Let's give it a crack. And then that was like I said, that was 10 years ago. I joined Movember, and it's been a fantastic journey since.
Unreal, and I think. In that space that you've worked in, that medical space, you mentioned yesterday that you do deal with people who are at that end of life chapter and that twilight zone, and they are reflective of what they've achieved or what they wanted to achieve, and in that space, I think it's important for us. We might be in that space next week, hopefully not, but we will be there one day. Like the one thing that we're guaranteed in being born is that one day we will die. And although it sounds like a bit of a morbid concept to think of, unless you think of it enough in a positive, strength-based way, we can't plan our impact or our time.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that, Sam?
Yeah, a really wise old emergency physician that we were talking to one day. I can't even remember the context. I think he was giving a lecture. But anyway, he said, I've spent a lot of my career talking to people at the end of their life. And he said almost universally, or he said, I've never seen anyone on their deathbed turn to me and say, geez, I wish I'd worked harder during my career. But he said, often you do see regret around family and relationships, and that people say, geez, I wish I'd spent more time with my kids, or I wish I'd spent more time with my family, or I wish I'd spent more time. I wish I hadn't had that falling out with my brother and not spoken to him for 30 years. So his observation was that working is great and building a career is fantastic. But the thing that people at the end of their life get to, and the big regret that they often have, is never about not getting a promotion or not doing a particular job. It's always about relationships and families.
It's powerful stuff, and that's where we need to bring it back to there, because once we get there and reflect, we don't need to reflect on it every hour of every day, but to get there, what does that mean for you, and what does that mean for me? And I think it's important that we raise that for fathers in that transition to fatherhood, because it's a window of opportunity to recalibrate what success looks like. You may not be the footy star that you wanted to be by the age of 32. You may not be the head of a partner at a law firm, or maybe you are and you found out it just sucks being a partner.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Maybe. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe it's great. I don't know. But the importance of being able to have that reflection time and that intentionality about what is your plan, I think separates us from just letting life circumstances dictate, who we become, so to speak. But Sam, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful to get to know you and to understand you in the context of your family, in the context of your role as a father, and the context of your role as a professional and a global, a global professional designing health programs for men across the world. It's an incredible space of influence that you've got, and it's just wonderful to hear that someone in that space has the values and principles that you do. So it's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been a fun chat. I've really enjoyed it, and I was reflecting as we've been going through. This has been a lot more about my non-professional part than it has actually been about what I do for a day job. And I think as I think back to the very first question, what does it mean to be a father? We often as blokes define ourselves by the job we do, but even this conversation today has just highlighted that actually what I bring to this conversation, the things we've talked about, we spent maybe 10% or 15% of the interview talking about the job that I do, and the other 80%, 85% talking about my role as a dad and what I bring to the table as a father. And I think that's something, I hope there's some kind of message in that actually what I bring to the world isn't entirely defined by my job title. What I bring to the world is defined by, my lived experience and who I am and what I can and can't do and how good or how bad I am at being a dad or being a person. And they're the things that people should, I think, acknowledge and remember you for.
Fantastic. I think if that's how they perceive this interview, then we've done our job. That's core to what we're aiming to achieve here. Hey, Blair, we're finishing up now. Did you have any questions? I know you often get a whole lot of time to reflect on some of the discussions, and sometimes there's a nugget of gold or a question or a prod to the interviewee that you might want to prod him with that he hasn't divulged enough or make him shed a tear.
Yeah. I was cheeky, man. I asked a bunch of questions before we actually started. So, but there's one. That's the beauty of where I'm the guy that just sits here and listens, and that awkward guy in the background. But I get to just absorb everything that you've been saying, and it's really cool because what I love is just be able to, because we're in different life stages, right? My kids aren't in primary school yet, even. And I get to see someone like in your position in the organization that you're in, and then your life stage with your kids and all that. And I love the opportunity to be able to envision myself like that in, say, 5 years and ask the questions like, oh, what does that look like for my family? And so that now I get the opportunity to ask you, as you've gone, because it's that, and as you said, like, it's great now that because you have that balance of going into the office and working from home. For me, not going to work anymore, having that opportunity to be more with my kids, I think my question is, what are you intentionally trying to invest in your kids as they currently? What is the highest value for you in investing in your kids? And then what does that look like? What is the practical outworking of that? Because you mentioned earlier, and I know this is a very long question, I apologize, but you mentioned earlier about how you're not wanting to be that just that voice of negativity to your boy because he's just getting all these corrections from all these different ways. And I just had that question of, what does that actually look like? But I want to make that bigger to what is your highest value and what does that practically look like you're imparting that into your family?
Yeah. So I'll start down low in some of the tactical bits. So two things that jump out off the back of that question. Number one is what are some of the tactical things that I'm kind of putting into the boys as we speak? And one of them is in sport. I never played a team sport when I was growing up, but I've made it my mission to ensure that every summer and every winter, my boys, both of them at under 8s and now under 13s, are playing a team sport, because I think it's really important that these boys learn that there are people who are going to give them guidance outside of me. And I know some of the work that Steve Badolf has done in raising boys talks about how, particularly once they hit sort of 10, 11, 12 years of age, boys will start to navigate away from male parental role models, and they need to find some other strong male role model in their life. And I think that the opportunity to put them in sporting clubs where where we know, having done our research, that there are great coaches, there are great role models that aren't parents, I think is really, really important. So I'm really keen to make sure that both of my boys play a team sport during their non-school time, because that's really important. And the other part is one thing that is different, I think, between when I grew up and when and how I'm trying to raise my kids, is that I make it a point, no matter what's happened during the day, no matter how horrible I've been as a dad, no matter how much I've shouted or how much of a good day it's been, every night when I leave the room after the boys have gone to bed, the younger one goes to bed first, and I go in and say goodnight to him. I make it a point every single night as I'm walking out the room to say, love you. And they say, love you too. Go into the other room with the older kid who's, usually half an hour later. As I'm walking out the room, I say, love you. And depending on how the day's gone, he either says, love you too, or he says, mm-hmm. And I leave the room. But I make it a point for them to know that no matter what happens, no matter whether it's a good day or a bad day, that love is unconditional. That love is continual, and it's nonstop. And that the things that I say, I hope, are outweighed by the things that I do.
Yeah, that's great, man. That's really encouraging. And I think that's really interesting, actually, about the sporting situation, because, again, we're in that stage of what do we want our kids to be involved in and all that sort of stuff as well. So that's really cool, man. That's really encouraging. Thank you.
And I guess it doesn't have to be sport, just to be clear. I mean, some kids are not sporty. So if it's some other group activity, whether it's, Girl Guides or Scouts or chess club or whatever, I think being around groups and learning how to be part of a team, I think is a really critical life skill that we're really, really keen to make sure that our kids get exposure to.
What a brilliant episode, Sam. You're an absolute legend, and I just loved everything you had to share with us today. If you would like to find out more about Movember's Family Man program, which is a research-backed online parenting program designed with dads in mind, then click the Get Support tab on our website at www.dadsgroup.org. Please remember to like, subscribe, and review, and please share with any dads and families that may benefit from hearing this episode. Cheers, guys, and have a great week.